July 17th, 2003, Dry Creek, Kansas. By noon, the heat had already bent the horizon into a wavering mirage, and the cornfields that once stood waist-high now cracked under a sky that hadn't given rain in 42 days. Dust moved like smoke across the empty road, and every man in town had learned to look down when the wind picked up because it carried nothing but loss. That was the day Ethan Cole drove his rusted 1987 Ford pickup up the long gravel path to Victor Hale's property. You could hear that truck. Before you saw it, engine, coughing, rattling, something loose in the back, knocking with every bump. It didn't belong on a road like that. Not in front of a place like Victor's. Victor Hale's farm didn't look like a farm anymore. It looked like a company. Steel irrigation arms stretched across the land like mechanical giants. Water flowed in perfect arcs, shimmering in the sun, feeding acres of green, while the rest of the county turned to dust. And parked outside the main house that day, 3 new tractors, a polished black SUV, and a group of men standing in the shade watching. Watching Ethan. He stepped out of this truck, slowly wiping his hands on his jeans. His shirt was faded sleeves, rolled boots worn down at the heel. He didn't look at the men. Not at first. He just stood there a moment, squinting at the irrigation system, listening. Because Ethan always listened first. But this wasn't a visit anyone expected him to make. Not to Victor. Not like this. Victor Hale stepped forward before Ethan could say a word. Tall, clean shirt, sunglasses. A man who hadn't worried about rain in years. He didn't greet Ethan, didn't offer a hand. He just looked him over and smiled. "Well," Victor said loud enough for everyone to hear, "if it isn't the man with the dead well." A few of the men chuckled. Ethan didn't react. "I heard about it." Victor continued pacing slowly like he was inspecting something broken. "Ran dry last month, didn't it?" "Took you long enough." Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "I need water." There was a pause. Not long. Just enough. Then the laughter came louder this time. Victor turned to the others, like Ethan had just told a joke. "You hear that?" he said. "He needs water." He stepped closer now, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal, but not enough to hide the mockery. "And you thought you'd come here?" Ethan held his ground. "I'll pay." Victor let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, I'm sure you would," he said. "With what?" "That truck." More laughter. But then Victor's expression changed just slightly. Something sharper behind the smile. "You know what your problem is, Ethan," he said. "You people, you hold on to things too long. Old land, old tools, old ideas." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "That well of yours, it's finished. Been finished. You just didn't have the sense to admit it." Ethan didn't look away. Behind Victor, one of the workers muttered, "Man's digging his own grave with that hole." Another voice. "Should have sold years ago." Victor raised a hand, quieting them just enough to deliver the line he'd been waiting for. "Tell you what," he said louder now, addressing not just Ethan, but everyone there. "You go back to that dry hole of yours. And if you can pull water out of it, real water, I'll pay you 10 times what you're offering me right now." A ripple moved through the group. Victor smiled wider. "But we both know that's not going to happen." The silence that followed wasn't kind. It was the kind of silence that settles when a man has already been decided. Ethan stood there a moment longer, the heat pressing down, the eyes on him, the laughter still hanging in the air. And then he nodded. Just once. Not in agreement, not in defeat, just acknowledgement. "I'll remember that," he said quietly. Victor smirked. "You do that." Ethan turned, walked back to his truck, and climbed in without another word. The engine struggled to turn over, coughing twice before catching. Dust rose behind him as he pulled away, leaving the green fields, the flowing water, and the sound of men laughing in his wake. What none of them noticed was that Ethan hadn't once asked how much the water cost, and that mattered more than anyone there understood. Because the truth was, he hadn't come to buy water. He had come to confirm something, and what he would do next would change everything in Dry Creek. But to understand that, you have to go back long before the drought. Long before Victor Hale owned half the county. Back to a time when water didn't come from steel machines, but from the hands of men who knew how to listen to the ground. Ethan Cole wasn't born into much. No one in Dry Creek was back then. But his father, Samuel Cole, had something most men didn't. Not money. Not land. He had patience, and a way of looking at the earth like it was speaking, even when no one else could hear a thing. Samuel was a well digger, not the kind with big drills or contracts. He worked with his hands, with steel rods, with rope and time. He didn't just dig holes. He studied the land, walked it slowly, eyes half closed sometimes, like he was feeling something beneath the surface. People used to joke about it, said he could hear water thinking, but when their own wells ran dry, they came looking for Samuel, and more often than not, he found it. Ethan grew up watching that, not learning from books, not from diagrams or engineers, from silence, from long walks across cracked fields where his father would stop, suddenly press a rod into the ground, and just wait. "I need to stop here and tell you something important," Samuel once said, when Ethan was 10 years old, standing beside a patch of land everyone else had given up on. "Water doesn't disappear." Ethan frowned. "Then where does it go?" Samuel smiled faintly, tapping the ground with his boot. "It moves," he said. "Always moving. You just have to know where it wants to be." At the time, Ethan didn't fully understand, but he remembered. He remembered the first well they dug together. 30 feet down before they hit damp soil. 40 before the first trickle. 50 before the ground gave way and water rushed in cold and steady. The men who hired Samuel stood there in disbelief. One of them whispered, "I thought this land was dead." Samuel just wiped his hands and said, "Land's not dead. People just stop listening." That well would go on to supply for 3 neighboring farms for over a decade, including the Cole family's land. That same well, the one everyone now called dead. Years passed. Machines came. Companies moved in. Drilling got faster. Deeper, louder. Men like Samuel were pushed aside not because they were wrong, but because they were slow. And in a world that was changing, slow looked like obsolete. Victor Hale was one of the first in Dry Creek to embrace that change. He bought land, aggressively installed modern irrigation, hired engineers who talked in numbers and pressure systems. And for a while it worked. Water flowed, crops grew, money followed. Meanwhile, Samuel Cole kept digging the old way, until the day he didn't. Ethan was 23 when his father collapsed beside that well, the same one, now sitting dry on their land. Heart gave out. No warning. No second chance. The town came to the funeral. Even Victor, though he stood at the back, silent. After that, Ethan took over. But something had changed, not just in the land. In the water. Within 5 years, wells across the region began to fail. Slowly at first. Then, all at once. The ground hadn't changed, but the flow had. Big companies drilled deeper, pulling water faster than the land could balance. Underground channels shifted. Pressure changed. And one by one, the old wells went quiet. People said it was over. Said Samuel had just been lucky. Said the old ways couldn't keep up. But there was something nobody knew. Something Ethan had never told a soul. The last night before his father died, Samuel had taken him out to the well. It was late. Windless. The kind of silence that makes every sound feel important. Samuel didn't bring tools, just a small worn notebook. He handed it to Ethan without a word. Inside were pages of hand-drawn maps. Lines, curves, markings that didn't match any official survey. "These aren't wells," Ethan said, confused. "No," Samuel replied. "They're paths." Paths of what? Samuel looked at the ground, then back at his son. Of where the water goes, when men think it's gone. Ethan didn't ask more. He didn't need to, because years later, standing in the heat, driving away from Victor Hale's laughter, those same lines were burned into his memory. And for the first time since the well ran dry, they started to make sense. Because the well hadn't died. It had been abandoned. by everyone, except the one man who remembered how to listen. The morning after Ethan drove away from Victor Hale's land, Dry Creek woke up to the same heat. But something in the air had shifted. Not in the sky, in the way people talked. Word had already spread. Ethan went begging. Victor laughed him right off the property. Heard he still thinks that old well can be saved. Men said it over coffee at Miller's Diner. They said it leaning against trucks, wiping sweat from their necks, staring out at fields that weren't going to make it to harvest. And every version of the story ended the same way, with a shake of the head, with a quiet certainty. He's finished. But Ethan didn't go back to town that morning. He drove straight past his house, past the barn with the leaning door, all the way out to the far edge of his land, where the old well sat like a scar in the earth. The ground around it had hardened into cracked plates. The rope was still tied to the beam, frayed and stiff, unmoved for months. If you didn't know better, you'd think nothing had ever come from it. Ethan stepped out of the truck, carrying only a shovel, a metal rod, and something wrapped in cloth. He stood there for a long time without moving, listening, not to the wind, not to the silence, to the memory of something beneath it, because this story wasn't really about digging a deeper hole, and that's where most people got it wrong. By midday, he had already started, not at the well, but 10 feet away from it, then 15, then 20. Anyone passing by would have seen it immediately. This wasn't how you fixed a dry well. You went down, not sideways. But Ethan wasn't digging down. He was carving into the earth at an angle, slow, deliberate, as if he already knew exactly where he was going. By the second day, a few people stopped to watch. By the third, they stayed longer. Man's lost it. One of them muttered, leaning on the fence. He's digging away from the well, another said. That's not how water works. Ethan didn't answer, didn't even look up. He just kept working, and every so often he would stop, drive that metal rod into the soil, and wait. Not seconds, minutes, sometimes longer, like he was listening for something no one else could hear. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Ethan wasn't guessing. He was following something. That night, when the watchers finally left, and the land fell quiet, Ethan sat on the edge of the pit he'd started. His hands were blistered, his shirt soaked through. He reached into the truck and pulled out the cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was his father's notebook. The pages had yellowed at the edges, dirt smudged into the corners, lines drawn in pencil, some faint, some retraced over and over, like they had been corrected, vified. Not maps, not exactly. They didn't match property lines, didn't follow fences or roads. They curved, they branched, they bent in ways that didn't make sense unless you understood what they were tracing. Paths. Samuel had said it once long ago. These are where the water goes, when men think it's gone. Ethan flipped to a page he hadn't looked at in years. A line ran straight through the center of their land, but it didn't stop at the well. It veered, shifted, like something had pushed it aside. I need to stop here and tell you something important his father had said that night. Water doesn't disappear. At the time, Ethan thought he meant patience. Now, he understood something else. Water can be moved, forced, redirected, and years ago, someone had done exactly that. About a mile east of Ethan's land, long before Victor built his empire, a drilling company had come through. They went deep, far deeper than any local well digger ever had. They were chasing volume, efficiency, profit. But when you pull that much water that fast, you don't just take it, you change everything around it. The pressure shifts. The underground paths bend, and sometimes a source doesn't dry up. It gets pushed somewhere else. That's what Ethan was looking at in his father's notebook. Not a dead well, a displaced one. But this story wasn't just about knowing that. It was about knowing where it went. On the 5th day, the hole had grown into a narrow trench, sloping downward at a strange angle that made no sense to anyone watching. Even the few who had defended Ethan in town started to doubt. You think he's onto something? One man asked quietly. Another shook his head. If there was water, Victor's engineers would have found it. That idea spread fast, because Victor didn't ignore things like this. Not when it threatened his position. On the 6th day, a black SUV rolled up to the edge of Ethan's property. Same one from the farm. Victor stepped out, sunglasses on 2 men behind him. Clean shirts, clipboards, the kind of men who didn't get dirt on their hands. Engineers. They didn't greet Ethan. They didn't ask permission. They just walked up to the edge of the trench and looked down. One of them laughed under his breath. "This isn't even aligned with any known aquifer," he said. The other nodded. "Angle's wrong. Depth's insufficient. There's nothing here." Victor crossed his arms, looking down at Ethan, like he was watching a performance. "You're digging sideways now," he called out. "That's your new technique." A few people who had gathered nearby chuckled nervously. Ethan climbed out of the trench, slowly wiping dirt from his hands. He didn't look at the engineers. He looked at Victor. "You drilled east," Ethan said. Victor smirked. "Of course I did. That's where the water is." Ethan shook his head slightly. That's where it was. Something flickered across Victor's face just for a moment. Then it was gone. The engineer spoke up again, louder this time, almost enjoying it. "There is no viable water source in this direction," he said, pointing toward the line Ethan had been digging. "We've surveyed the entire region. Scientifically." That word hung in the air. Scientifically. It sounded final, definitive, like something that couldn't be argued with. The crowd shifted. You could feel it. That slow turning of belief back toward certainty, back toward Victor, back toward the man with machines and data and control. Victor smiled again. "You hear that he said to Ethan? Science." He turned, already walking back toward his vehicle. "Save your strength," he added over his shoulder. "You're going to need it when you come back to buy water." The SUV door slammed shut. Dust rose behind them as they drove away. And just like that, the crowd began to thin, because in their minds, the outcome had already been decided. But there was something they missed, something small. When the engineer had pointed, when he had traced the direction Ethan was digging, Ethan had smiled. Not wide, not proud, just a quiet, knowing smile. Because the line the engineer had dismissed was the exact same line drawn in his father's notebook. And that night, for the first time since he started digging, Ethan didn't stop early. He worked past sunset, past darkness, by lantern light. The trench grew deeper, narrower, the air inside it heavier. At one point, the wall shifted just slightly, dirt falling in a soft cascade. For a moment, it looked like the whole thing might collapse. He climbed out, breathing hard, staring down into the hole. When anyone else would have stopped, waited, reinforced. But Ethan didn't, because this wasn't the first time he'd stood at the edge of something unstable. And it wouldn't be the last. By the 10th day, fewer people came to watch. By the 12th, almost none. The story had lost its appeal. It was no longer a spectacle, just a man digging a hole in the wrong direction. But what happened next was the part nobody forgot. On the 19th day, just before sunrise, Ethan climbed down into the trench like he had of every morning. The air was cooler, the ground slightly softer beneath his boots. He drove the metal rod into the wall, paused, closed his eyes, and then he heard it. Not loud, not obvious, just a faint, hollow shift, like something moving behind the earth. He froze, tapped again. There it was, different from anything he'd heard before. Not dry, not solid, something in between. And in that moment, every line in his father's notebook snapped into place. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, because he knew he wasn't digging anymore. He was about to break through. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. Down in that narrow trench, with dirt packed tight around him, and the early light just beginning to creep over the horizon, the world felt still, like everything was waiting. He tapped the rod again. That same hollow response came back, soft, distant, alive. Not empty, not dry, alive. And that was the difference. Most men, when a well runs dry, they think in straight lines. They think deeper means better, more pressure, more drilling, more force. But Ethan had learned something different. Water doesn't obey force. It obeys paths. And right now, he was standing inches away from one. He set the rod aside and picked up the shovel. The metal edge pressed into the soil slower now, more careful. Each movement measured, controlled. Because this was where most men failed. They rushed. They broke through too fast. And when you did that, You didn't find water. You lost it. The dirt began to change texture. Less resistance, more weight. Dampness clung to the blade. The air shifted cooler, heavier. Ethan stopped. Up. Titsirapi listened again. There it was. Stronger now. Not a sound exactly. More like a pressure you could feel in your bones if you knew what to listen for. He drove the shovel forward. More time. And the wall gave way. At first, nothing happened. Just a small collapse. A pocket opening where solid earth had been. Mud trickled down. Ethan stepped back instinctively. And then, a low, deep crack, like something releasing after years of being held back. What happened next was the part nobody forgot. The ground shuddered beneath his boots. A thin stream burst through the opening, dark, muddy weak. For a second, it looked like failure, like all he had done had led to this. But Ethan didn't move, because he knew better. Water doesn't arrive all at once. It remembers how to return. The trickle grew. Pressure built behind it. The mud turned to flow, and then it exploded. A surge of water tore through the wall, slamming into the trench with a force that knocked Ethan back against the side. Cold, violent, unstoppable. Within seconds, the narrow trench filled the current, rising fast, climbing toward the surface, like it had been waiting years for this moment. Ethan scrambled up, gripping the edge, pulling himself out as water rushed beneath him, churning alive. By the time he reached the top, the ground was already shaking with it. The old well 20 feet away began to tremble. A deep, hollow rumble echoed through its shaft. And then, from the place everyone had abandoned, water surged upward, clearer this time, stronger. A column rising from the heart of the earth like something reclaimed. By mid-morning, the noise had reached the road. By noon, the first truck arrived. Then another, and another. People stood at the edge of Ethan's land, staring in silence, as water poured steadily from the well that had been declared dead. No machines, no pumps, no steel arms, just pressure and patience, and a path that had finally been reopened. Someone whispered, "That's not possible." Another said nothing at all, because there are moments when explanation feels smaller than what you're looking at. And this was one of them. Victor Hale Knight arrived just before sunset. Same black SUV, same dust trailing behind it. But this time, no one was laughing. He stepped out slowly, removing his sunglasses as he walked toward the well. The sound of water filled the air, constant, steady, undeniable. Ethan stood nearby, shirt-soaked, hands raw, watching the flow like he'd seen it 1,000 times before. Victor stopped a few feet away. For once, he didn't speak immediately. He just looked at the water, at the trench, at the angle of the earth where Ethan had dug, and then finally at the man he had dismissed. "This won't last," Victor said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Ethan didn't answer. Victor stepped closer to the well, crouching, slightly running his hand through the stream. He felt the pressure, the temperature, the consistency. It was real, more than real. It was stable, and that's when it hit him. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was a source, a deep one, deeper than the systems he had built his entire operation on. Victor stood up slowly. "You redirected it," he said, almost to himself. Ethan finally spoke. "No," he said quietly. "I followed it." That was the moment, the exact moment when the balance in Dry Creek shifted. Not with a shout, not with applause, but with silence, heavy, undeniable silence. Because every man standing there understood what it meant. Water was power, and for the first time in years, Victor Hale didn't control it. The days that followed changed everything. At first, people came just to see it. Then, they came with questions. Then, with requests. Ethan didn't advertise, didn't make announcements, didn't raise his voice. He just worked, reinforced the trench, stabilized the well, built a simple system of channels, wood pipe, whatever he had. And when the first farmer asked how much he would charge for water, Ethan paused, because this was the moment that defined everything that came after. Victor would have set a price, high, strategic, calculated. But Ethan remembered something his father had said, standing over a well that fed 3 farms instead of 1. Water's not meant to belong to a man, Samuel had told him. It's meant to pass through him. So Ethan gave an answer no one expected. Bring what you can, he said. If you can't, take what you need anyway. At first, people didn't believe him. They waited for the catch, for the hidden cost. It never came, and slowly, quietly, they stopped going to Victor. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to be felt. Within weeks, trucks that once lined up at Victor's gates began turning down Ethan's road instead. Within months, Victor's prices dropped, then dropped again. But it didn't matter, because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about something far more difficult to buy back. Trust. Victor came back one evening long after the crowds had gone. No engineers, no audience, just him. Ethan was sitting by the well, watching the water move in the fading light. Victor stood there for a while before speaking. I'll buy it, he said finally. The land. The well. All of it. Ethan didn't look at it. It's not for sale. Victor exhaled slowly. Everyone has a price. Ethan shook his head. Not for this. There was a long silence. And then Victor asked the question he should have asked weeks ago. How did you know? Ethan looked down at the water, then back toward the old trench, the line that had changed everything. My father showed me, he said. Victor frowned. That's it. Ethan considered that. Then at it he also told me something else. Victor waited. Ethan's voice stayed calm. Steady. Don't laugh at things you don't understand. The words hung there between them. Not sharp. Not angry. Just true. Victor didn't reply, because there wasn't anything left to say. Years later, people in Dry Creek would still talk about that summer, about the drought, about the day the dead well came back to life. But the ones who were there, the ones who saw it happen, remembered something else. They remembered the moment a man stopped trying to control the land and started listening to it instead. Because in the end, this was never just a story about water. It was about arrogance, about patience, about the quiet kind of knowledge that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand attention, but waits until the moment it's needed most. And when that moment comes, it doesn't just prove people wrong. It reminds them of something they should have known all along, that not everything old is useless, that not everything simple is weak, and that sometimes the man standing quietly in the dust knows more than the one standing in the water.